staying with that story, South Africa's state-owned enterprises have been in crisis for years. Eskom is undoubtedly a big problem. It has been since 2007, its inability to keep the lights on. The state arms manufacturer Denel has been stumbling from one financial crisis to another. And after years of surviving on essentially taxpayer money, government bailouts, South African Airways was the first public entity to be put into business rescue. What are the answers to try and help solve the issues we have with state-owned enterprises and the fact that they are money pits where all of our hard-earned money keeps funneling to try and just keep them alive? To help me answer some of those questions, I'm joined by Professor Patrick Bond. He's a professor of political economy at the University of Western Cape's School of Governance. Thank you for your time, Patrick. This was the model during apartheid, wasn't it? To help Afrikaners lift themselves out of poverty, massive state enterprises were created that became employment magnets for the vast majority of Afrikaners.
Oh, well, it's great. Thanks for having me. It's great to think back to the 1920s and 30s because there was a poor white problem, and it was partially solved through Eskom, ISCOR, the old Iron and Steel Corporation, which then was privatized in 1989 and is now called ArcelorMittal. And then, of course, there were railroads, post offices. So the state can do for the public interest, which at the time was a white state, can mop up unemployment or can provide services that the private sector wouldn't provide. And indeed, Eskom had its origins because the private sector, Victoria Falls Electricity Company, wasn't strong enough to get deep mining, the electricity required. So there are lots of reasons that you want to start state enterprises. And often it's to do with cross-subsidy because the private sector company maximizes profits, doesn't think necessarily about the public interest, the environment, about cross-subsidizing to make the services affordable. And that's where a government agency or a state-owned enterprise should. SAA is very different because it was really serving the middle and upper classes. There wasn't any cross-subsidization. And as you say, it was a single.
Right. So we know that the model can work. It's worked in South Africa during the apartheid era, no question. It still works in other economies around the world. We know China, perhaps, but also China's very, very strong in terms of its private enterprise. Why is it such a disaster here? Can you pinpoint that?
Well, the easy answer is there has been an upsurge in looting, and especially in the way in which public and private operate together. We do have, unfortunately, not just a corrupt layer at the top of the state, and that's something Cyril Ramaphosa is even having to go into his own political camp to clean out, as we've seen with the health minister, maybe the mining and energy minister. But it's also because our private sectors had a bad habit since apartheid, a crime against humanity. PwC does a biannual survey, and they find when they look at economic crime, usually Sandton and Stellenbosch, Mhlanga, Central Cape Town, they rank at the very highest. In fact, this year we're number 2, tied with China behind India. So I would say the public-private pilfering problem, it's one that extends well beyond the formal state and goes very deep into procurement arrangements, black economic empowerment deals, and the way in which, white capital has basically been looting the place, taking money abroad through illicit financial flows. So there has been a very serious culture of corruption.
So why is it that that wasn't the case in the previous era? It must have been, surely. But somehow or the other, those state-owned enterprises function, and I know they were only supporting a small minority of overall South Africans. But what is it about our inability now to stop this looting, to stop the graft? It sounds to me like we're not going to get to the end of that.
Well, it depends. It depends on the social forces and whether there are civil society and working class and public interest-minded people in the society that blow the whistle, and we've seen that. We saw Zuma must go, and we've seen movements, for example, to get AIDS medicines for free for 6 million people that raise the life expectancy. We've seen Fees Must Fall, get access to tertiary education. These are inspiring, right? So these are movements of citizens that blow the whistle. But I think I like a guy called Frantz Fanon. Fanon wrote in the 50s, and he died in 1961, but he could foresee that post-colonial African states would have a problem because whether it's in a South Africa, a Zimbabwe, a Kenya, a white settler colonial bloc sits on top and prevents accumulation by a middle class, or in a poorer country, it's international capital. And that's why the state becomes more of a locus for accumulation, for a class forming, when it shouldn't. It should have the initiative, the ambition, the ability to make profits outside the state. But as I say, it's blocked from doing so. But if you look at our other agendas, which would include, for example, transport, we need desperately to subsidize poor and working class people. They're getting nailed by, the high prices of transport. And our transport subsidy was going to people like myself, right? Every time I flew on SAA, that was a 1,000 Rand gift from the fiscus to someone like me for every ticket. Or Caltrain, it's over 100 Rand. And that distortion in which the class agenda of poor people has been repressed on behalf of this new class. I mean, I would blame some of the ANC who really held on to an SAA because of the perks, the free flights, the prestige of a kind of a national airline. And in that sense, it's a shame that even though we've seen probably a good entrepreneur, Gideon Novik, picking this up with Jabu Moleketi's group, financial group. Maybe it has some history of dubious activities with PIC. But nevertheless, what people really had thought might happen is that SAA would join with an Emirates, with Ethiopian. Those are two state-owned airlines that do very, very well. They're geographically better located. That is one reason why SAA went down since the boom of airline, because we're just way down at the bottom of the continent. But it does strike me as a tragedy that as South Africa wants to be an open space for business to the rest of the continent, none of those routes that South Africa was so good at doing, SAA was really the airline to fly into the continent. Those don't seem like they're going to be high priorities to start up again.
Now, you say that, so some people say that everything should be privatized, that will be better, but you've already exposed quite clearly when you were speaking to us now about the complicity of private enterprise involved in looting. Is that the answer? I mean, a lot of people posit that if it was run by private enterprise, we'd be better off. Surely that can't be the only way.
Well, it would be nice, if there was a simple silver bullet answer, but those who would argue to privatize everything have to come to grips with the corrupt character of our business elites. PwC lays it out. Or, for example, the procurement officer in the Treasury, Kenneth Brown, he said before he quit under assassination threats, when he was trying to clean this up, he said that 35 to 40% of every contract was overcharged from the private sector. So, we've been seeing with the Gupta situation how much additional payments, and these aren't just our local entrepreneurs, it's the big boys, it's PwCs and Ernst & Youngs and especially KPMGs, and one company, Bell Pottinger from London, had to be, executed by public outrage as a result of that. And another one called Cash Paymaster Services was pushed into bankruptcy last year, again by public anger. So I do think building this state, I'm biased, I teach in the School of Government, building this state is important with accountability, where we can clearly say a public interest agenda. And that's why an ESCOM is the most important. 400 billion Rand in debt, but with corrupt deals, Medupi with the ANC and Hitachi, things like that were very common. Can these institutions be saved? In the case of SAA, apparently not. The big unions there may have something to say. The pilots, very powerful. The NUMSA, in alliance with the stewards, they have been able, in 2019, for example, to shut down the airline on strike. So I'm not sure what they're going to do to try to respond to a privatized airline that will give them lower salaries and maybe less favorable working conditions. But the public interest is always critical, and asking ourselves, who's getting the money? Is that subsidy going to the right people, the poorest people in the most unequal society in the world? What's the implication for the environment? I might add that COVID-19 threw tourism into disarray, but the carbon taxes that will start to hit airlines will make people rethink these long flights to places like South Africa for international tourism. So there's a lot to be put on the table in the public interest, like avoiding a climate catastrophe where, airline flights, and I can say as somebody who had platinum and, we're all down to kind of blue on our SAA Voyager, we're all interested in whether this airline can really build back better rather than be part of the problem.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor Patrick Bond, who's Professor of Political Economy at the University of Western Cape School of Governance. Very quick summary. Back to key words like accountability, stop the looting. Those are things we know. That's how you start fixing social our enterprises. And if we don't do that, we'll continue to be in the situation that we are in right now.